To be brave is to behave bravely when your heart is faint. So you can be brave only when you really ain't. It's the high time. There's a lot of brave people in this room, and we're remembering a lot of brave people tonight. There are the scientists who said, I have my truth, and I question yours. And they knew that their careers were on the line. There are the mothers who had the life of their babies on the line. There are the gay men who said, the rest of you might believe this, but I don't. And there were the Africans who said, beware of white men bearing money. And there are icons like Christine Majori. And I think that little poem I read, and I prefer poems that are only 4 lines long, because it's the only ones I can remember. How did she feel as an HIV-positive mother about her children, her husband, herself, and all the people who relied on her? I'm sure at many times she felt, as in the poem, very scared inside, but she was always there for us. There are the journalists who put their careers on the line, and some of those are here tonight. It's a sure way to end your career as a journalist in many countries. And that's another form of bravery. And then the flip side of bravery, of course, is cowardice. And we see people like Luc Montagnier saying one thing just to one group of people, and a totally different thing to other people, depending on how it affects his career, his status, his position in the world. We see people like Joseph Sonnabend who asked questions, but when the pressure got too high, he stopped asking the questions. He still questions things, but only in private. And you can only draw it out of him in private. So I would now, are Siggy and David Rasnick here? I'd like them both to come up for just a brief second.
1 second.
Yes. Okay, I wanted to give you two a hug for 2 reasons. First of all, they are my right-hand woman and my left-hand man on the organization of this conference. They've done the most of the work. But secondly, we're going to play a little game. I used to be a Boy Scout leader, and I learned that you never start a meeting without a game, because people misbehave if they don't have a little game with it. So the rules of this game are that you can only be hugged if you've already been hugged, and when you're hugged, you stand up if possible, or if it's, for some people it's not, that's fine. And then we'll see how quickly it takes for the whole room to be standing. This is an illustration of exponential growth, which is important. So us 3 have been hugged, so we now have to find people to hug, and then as soon as you're hugged, you go find somebody else to hug, and we keep going until everybody in the room has had a hug. Let's go. Okay, stand up. Hug somebody else. Oh, Crystal. Okay, you have to hug somebody else. I've always wanted to say that. I'm not being a minister, it's my heart. I hope a couple of things we can learn from exponential growth is that our movement could grow like this if we all touched another person and keep touching, and those people go and send the questions, the messages that we have around the world. It's the only way this organization is going to grow. It's not really an organization as much as a movement, which this organization, Rethinking AIDS, is a very small part of, but a critical part of. A second thing, it made me think about, what if there was an HIV? And what if you were infected with one particle today, and this slow virus divided once a day, which is very slow for something microscopic. How many particles would you have at the end of a month? Well, I'm sure you all know that 2 to the power of 30 is approximately 1 billion. You can get out your calculators if you want to check this. Now, 1 billion particles of 100 nanometers isn't really that much. You probably couldn't even see it. But what about after the second month? Well, you would now have, according to my calculations, 4 liters of HIV. So how can you have a slow virus when even at this slow period of growth, you end up with this massive quantity after only 2 months? There's actually a Chinese story about this, about the king who, this peasant did something for him, and he said, you can have everything you want. And of course, in most fairy tales, the young lad said, I want your daughter as my wife. Always seems to be the answer. He said, no, no, anything but that. So he asked for a grain of rice, and then he said, every day I want you to give me double. So at first it's fine, 1 grain, 2 grains, 4 grains. But at the end of 30 days, that's 1 billion grains. Pretty soon he had the entire kingdom and the king's daughter as his wife. I was, just if you'll be, I forgot to bring up to the stage everything that I need. So I travel a lot in my business. As some of you know, I've met other dissidents in Korea and India and all around the world. As I travel on business, I try to mix a little AIDS rethinking with my business. So I had this opportunity to go undercover into a new drug facility, and I found out about this new drug that they're producing. It's called GZP, and I know you've not heard about it. They have this slogan for this drug. Well, first of all, I had to go undercover. I needed a false name, so I used the name Joseph Newton. Some of you may realize the irony. I was thinking of Joseph Stalin, but I thought that might be a little too obvious. So I went in, and they showed me this demonstration of this new drug. And their slogan of this drug is, we put the nuke back in nuke. And they said that 1 pill can eliminate HIV in a 10 square mile radius. Not only in the HIV positives, but in everybody else who might be silently HIV positive. And so I was able to get a pill, 1 pill, without the active ingredient. And you know, they've rammed a lot of things down our throats, so I need a volunteer for this pill. Any volunteers? And the active ingredient is plutonium. And that's why it's very good in rural areas, because actually you can't take the pill unless you live at least 100 miles away from the hospital where the doctors are. So to me, it seems like there are 4 currents in our struggle. There is the purity of science. Maybe purity is not quite the right word. The integrity of science, which is being corrupted by the AIDS establishment. And that's one really, really important factor that goes far beyond just HIV and AIDS. I think HIV and AIDS is just the worst manifestation of the corruption of science. Then there is the issue of human rights, the people who are in jail, who've lost their kids. That's the second leg. 2 other legs are, of course, the media that's silent, the media that suppresses, the media that eliminates people who ask questions. And I think the 4th leg is the legal leg, the attacks on people who are HIV positive, our attempts to right the wrongs of the past, to people who've been injured by drugs, people who have suffered greatly from the HIV theory. And so when we were discussing who was going to be the keynote speaker, we wanted a fresh voice, one that you might not have heard before. And it seemed that somebody could address the issues of both journalism and what Michael Tracey calls the injustice system. which is very prevalent in many countries, in many cases. It seemed that would be a voice that would be very fresh and very important to listen to. We will be hearing from many of the famous rethinking scientists over the weekend, HIV-positive people, many names that are familiar to us, but we wanted the keynote speaker to be somebody new, with new messages that I hope will inspire us in different ways. You can read Michael Tracey's biography in the brochure that you have, but he has a very distinguished career as a scholar and practitioner of journalism with a great interest in the American injustice system, which of course is very similar to the injustice systems of many countries around the world. So I would like to welcome Michael Tracey to the stage to give his keynote speech. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Have a little juice to begin with. Thank you for those opening remarks. It's true. When I was coming in, there's a gentleman, where is he? He was there, who kind of said in a very polite way, like, "Who the hell are you?" It was a good question. And because while a number of years ago I was thinking about the whole HIV/AIDS issue, to be honest, I moved on into looking at other areas. In my mind, areas that are conceptually related. In fact, if you Google my name, you won't find many mentions of HIV/AIDS, but you'll find a hell of a lot of mentions of one Jean-Benet Ramsey, who I spent many years looking into, and in fact have made 3 documentaries that were shown both in the UK and the US, and actually about 30 other countries. I'm not going to touch too much on Jean-Benet, but I say conceptually, the issue that I want to talk about tonight, which is really a kind of, is it basically a personal reflection. It was interesting to be invited to give this speech, slightly unnerving, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, but it was interesting to go back and look at what I'd written before, many years ago, 15 years ago, basically. And it was rather satisfying to look at what I'd written and actually still agree with it. Now, before I start my talk, I want to make the point. Normally, when I speak, when I give public lectures, I speak from notes. It's just much more, it's just something that I find more comfortable. I'm not very good at reading texts, so do please bear with me. But I thought, okay, Tracey, you've agreed to do this, and there'll be people who want to trash you for doing it. That kind of goes with the patch. But that doesn't mind. I don't mind. You know, I've been trashed many times over the whole Ramsey thing, and I got extremely thick skin, and Brits like a fight. But I decided that rather than just talking from notes, what I would do is I would actually prepare a text, which I'm going to read. So do please bear with me on this. But I wanted to feel that I got it right, anticipating criticisms that may come down the road. So when Peter Duesberg emailed me and asked if he could nominate me to give this opening address, I was kind of blown away, and surprised and pleased and honored. And he said, would I give some welcoming remarks? And so without further ado, welcome. I should add right up front that there's also certain trepidation in accepting the invitation, honored though I was, since I knew that there would be some serious scientists present and writers and journalists who have spent their careers studying science. The closest I ever came to doing science was in grammar school in England. We had to take chemistry. I remember how proud my mother was when she bought me a lab coat, all nice and white and crisp. Didn't make much difference, and I never really did get much beyond learning how to light the Bunsen burner, and even that was a bit dodgy. I didn't do very well. In fact, the one and only thing I really remember from that time was that our teacher, Dr. Keith, the school was ever so proud that he had a doctorate, or at least he told them he had, was in fact a sadist who liked to flog boys with a rather large cane. But it was a Catholic school run by the De La Salle Christian Brothers, so that was about par for the course. You know, it's kind of part of the curriculum. As a media scholar, and more recently as a documentary filmmaker, what I explore are the ways in which the mass media come between us and reality, indeed begin to construct interpretations of reality, which we then act on, and as it were, make real. It is and was here that my whole interest in how we, the society, came to think about HIV/AIDS lies. For me, the story began late on a Sunday evening at my home in Boulder, Colorado, early 1990s, maybe 1992. Insofar as I'd ever thought about AIDS, it was in the conventional ways of HIV infection, unsafe sex, death, we're all at risk, condom mania, dramatic TV commercials of crashing headstones, and the general sense that sexual excess was a shortcut to the cemetery, that any sex, excessive or not, was like to have the direst consequences. It was about midnight. I'd just returned from a trip abroad. The house was quiet. A rather fine glass of Chablis in hand. I was doing what I normally do in front of the TV. I was surfing the channels. I happened on a discussion program hosted by the black journalist Tony Brown. I lingered, and what I heard began to fascinate me. The discussion was of AIDS, and the fact that the HIV hypothesis was, as one of the participants put it, dead. It was one of those moments that remain etched on the memory. The interviewee, I recall, had this round face, hair parted on the side. I seem to recall also he was wearing a greenish tweed jacket, V-neck sweater, and tie. And he wore these Harry Potter glasses. In fact, it occurs to me, he wore Harry Potter glasses before Harry Potter wore Harry Potter glasses. So I don't know if Mr. Lauritson's here. Is he here? It's an extreme pleasure to meet you. The specific discussion was about iatrogenic medicine in the context of AIDS, that the treatments were more dangerous than infection, that AZT in particular was a killer. John started talking about AIDS in ways which I had never heard, and which I found puzzling, but somehow riveting, and to be honest, convincing. I may not be a scientist, but I have a very good nose for a good argument. I realized that he was challenging one of the most powerful beliefs of the age. The HIV virus was deadly, democratic, in that we're all at risk, and it would be the next pandemic, rivaling those of pre-modernity. I also heard something that startled me. In the process of moving to the US, I'd had 2 AIDS tests, one for an insurance policy, the other for the INS as part of my application for permanent residency. The INS test is part of a general inquiry into one's fitness to live within the Republic, and includes answering questions as to whether one is now or has ever been insane. Only the feds, eh? Only the feds. Whether one plans to overthrow by force of arms the elected government. And, this was priceless, whether one plans to profit from the proceeds of prostitution. And I had to answer these questions for my children, who were then aged 5, 4, and 18 months. So I didn't know if they were insane, or whether they would have nefarious lives later. I will remember the curious feeling of waiting for the results of the tests, that weird rewind of life. You know, that night, I was nervous. If this test came back positive, that was it. Life was over, family destroyed, the Grim Reaper hovering there, one more victim of the plague. And we would have been deported so that I could die my miserable death back home in the UK. Knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous. The test came back negative, great sigh of relief, life could go on. As I sat there on that Sunday evening, I heard that the test was not testing for the virus, it was testing for antibodies to the virus. To test positive was to be told that your body had, I know I'm saying, by the way, something you all know, but this was a revelation for me. To test positive was to be told that your body had the antibodies, not the virus. Now, I'm not a scientist, but somewhere from the caverns of memory, I seem to recall from biology classes that the presence of antibodies indicated that the body had fought off infection. As I listened, I also heard that some scientists believed that the virus did not cause AIDS. I was fascinated. If there was any accuracy whatsoever to what I was hearing, to what John was saying, what on earth had been going on for the previous decade, almost decade, of public discourse about AIDS? I had no way of knowing whether the statements which were clearly heretical were accurate, sort of accurate, or downright wrong. But as I began to ask myself the what-if question, another question logically followed. How, in fact, had the HIV hypothesis come to be so quickly and firmly lodged in the Western imagination? Why had I never heard these kinds of arguments before? Why had I just assumed that what I had heard about AIDS was necessarily true? Even to pose that question felt curious for a moment, because by definition, one was problematizing something which had been presented for years as totally unproblematic. The only way to find an answer to these questions was to go back to the beginning. So I set out to try and find out for myself. As a non-scientist, I started to read. We're all very familiar with the origin of the age of AIDS, of how towards the end of 1979, Joel Weisman, an LA physician, noticed a small group of young gay men who were suffering from illnesses which, by all conventional theory, they should not have been, in particular the fact that they had PCP. The histories of this time tell us something else about the patients. The 5 subjects all used poppers on a regular basis, and one was an intravenous drug user. The CDC at the time suggested, quote, the possibility of a cellular immune dysfunction related to common exposure that predisposes individuals to opportunistic infections such as pneumocystis and candidiasis. That statement was June the 5th, 1981. The time of AIDS had begun. Sort of. The real beginning of the age of AIDS, in my view, was April 24th, 1984, when Margaret Heckler, US Secretary of Health and Human Services, stood up before a huge audience of journalists to announce that Dr. Robert Gallo and his colleagues at the National Cancer Institute had isolated a new virus, proved that it was the cause of AIDS, were putting the finishing touches to a test that would be made available in November and would have vaccine ready within 2 years. The slight problem, of course, as everyone in this room knows, is those were barefaced lies. But then this was Ronald Reagan's America. He was up for re-election and was under considerable pressure to do something about this emerging epidemic. The flavor of the moment is captured by Heckler's comments to the throng of journalists. Today we add another miracle to the long honor roll of American medicine and science. Today's discovery represents a triumph of science over a dreaded disease. Those who have disparaged the scientific search, those who said we weren't doing enough, have not understood how sound, solid, significant medical research proceeds. It's beautiful, isn't it? This is Margaret Heckler. What the journalists were hearing, but were in no way able to question, and which they would relate to their readers, viewers, and listeners around the world over the coming days, months, and years, was the orthodoxy of AIDS. What you all know. AIDS does not occur in the absence of HIV infection, and HIV infection is a necessary and sufficient condition for causing AIDS. Whenever I lecture about this to students, who actually are a very interesting, receptive audience, they like to hear counter-theses. Whenever I lecture about this, I show video footage of the Heckler press conference and freeze frame it and ask my students, or whoever else I'm talking to, what they see. The answer is obvious. Dozens of microphones feeding her words across the globe. On March the 24th, AIDS was a mystery. On March the 25th, it was a truism. The effect of the press conference was immediate and extraordinarily powerful in determining the parameters of all future debates about AIDS. The words virus, cause, AIDS became inseparably linked, utterly unquestioned by all but the most marginal media. To give you a sense of the force of the orthodoxy, I'd like to refer to a fascinating piece of work by one of my doctoral students, Denny Wilkins, who's now gone on to a successful academic career as a media studies person himself. He decided to interrogate a database of 37 major newspapers in the US and the UK. Denny searched for the number of stories in which the phrase AIDS virus was employed, a phrase which he correctly took as representing the notion of causality within the AIDS thesis. In 1984, there were just 31 mentions of the phrase, but by 1991, it was appearing in more than 3,000 stories a year in these 37 papers. By 1993, there had in fact been 20,024 uses of the term. Of countervailing theories, none. None. My point here is the thing that strikes me is that the narrative about AIDS was laid down very, very early on, and we've never quite escaped it. In fact, we've not never quite escaped it, we've never escaped it. Denny then had a look at how Mr. Gallo, Dr. Gallo, he of the Congressional Inquiry, had fared. He found alongside the name of Gallo hundreds of references to him which attached phrases such as noted, superstar, famed, vindication, significant strides, the one scientific hero, brilliant, dynamic, pioneering researcher who discovered or co-discovered the AIDS virus, Gallos's virus, and so on. Here was a pitch-perfect example of how public discourse is shaped, the construction of a way of seeing AIDS that was not open to questioning either by the media or any ordinary citizen, certainly. Science and Mrs. Heckler had uttered, and we would believe, because while there were other ways of seeing HIV/AIDS, it was almost instantly nigh and impossible to find a place in the public square to make those arguments, and denied that place for developing arguments for funding to support research to engage these competing theories empirically. Counter-theses had in effect been declared to have no importance and therefore no news value, and therefore no coverage, which would therefore confirm the lack of news value. What became troubling to me as I started to look into the arguments I'd heard John Lauritsen make, as I looked into it through his writings, through Professor Drewsberg's writings, the commentaries of Dave Rasnick and so on, I realized with a certain horror and anger that here were serious thinkers and researchers who were being utterly marginalized, attacked, and condemned as heretics. My point here is one doesn't need to be a scientist to recognize people with talent. And it was manifestly the case to me that here were people with very serious talent who were being shoved aside. That, in my book, was wrong, for reasons I'll come to at the end. I also realized that the HIV orthodoxy was perhaps a rather good example of the fact that it is perfectly possible to have internally consistent, even clever, debates that begin with a shared premise and continue to do so if that premise is never questioned, never problematized. If, however, the initial premise is flawed, misplaced, erroneous, or downright crazy, all the subsequent sophisticated discourse in the world will not negate the flaw, the misplacement, the error, or the craziness. So the case for the extent of the focus on AIDS, particularly in terms of the monies being spent, depends totally on the credibility of that initial premise. If that is incorrect, then everything else has been at best misguided, at worst a distracting waste of time. However, the orthodoxy was established and other contrarian views outlawed in a Gallo-led, Reagan-fed scientific coup d'etat. How did it work? One of the most potent ways in which the public can be led to see something this way rather than that is when a narrative enters popular culture and becomes taken as a given, something that any right-thinking person absolutely knows to be true. Stories, claims, declarations of fact, here, there, and everywhere, the same story told countless times, in countless venues, on radio and television, in magazines, movies, in the conversation in the pub or the restaurant, around the water cooler. Culture and the understandings which it contains and that the media fashion is made rather in the manner of a pointillist painting, in which a picture is constructed from tiny dots of pure color that one has to step back from and which, viewed from a distance, form into a recognizable shape. In this case, the picture of a germ that was an existential threat to humankind. As the narrative of HIV/AIDS unfolded in the months and years after Margaret Heckler's press conference, it was fed by a marriage of exaggeration and a public disposition to believe tall tales. In the middle 1980s, the talk show host Oprah Winfrey told her audience that 20% of all heterosexuals would be dead of AIDS by 1990. Gene Antonio, in his book The AIDS Cover-Up, which sold 300,000 copies, claimed that by 1990 there would be 64 million infected with HIV in the US. The television program and video AIDS, The World is Dying for the Truth, in 1988, began with the words, "In the course of human history, never before has a force, either natural or man-made, had a more devastating impact on the human race than a small virus, HIV." The script then quotes WHO figures of 100 million dead by the end of the century and states that the AIDS epidemic, quote, "poses a threat to mankind unparalleled in recorded history." One scientist giving evidence before Congress that was covered by the media said that she projected 5 billion infections, but that it could go as high as 10 billion. How do these people become scientists? That's my great mystery. The fact that this was twice the population of the planet did not seem to faze her. William Connor of the Hive Foundation referred to a threat that, quote, "exists on a species level. A species conflict is occurring. Put another way, it is us or the bug." As I read more, trying to understand the potency of the HIV argument, why they gained such traction in the media and the public imagination, I was clear that the basic argument that HIV is a harmless virus, that AIDS may be a non-infectious condition acquired by recreational drugs and other non-contagious risk factors, including the toxic effects of any anti-HIV treatments, and that therefore AIDS is a condition which is self-inflicted, would not be popular in some key circles. Got that one right. In fact, what was becoming increasingly obvious was that the strength of the paradigm depended not on any definitive scientific merits of the case, but rather upon a collusion of institutional and cultural forces, for which the media became the partly unwitting cheerleader. If one searched, it was possible to find arguments that pointed to other causalities from the very beginning. But the brute truth is that the media weren't looking, didn't want to look, and probably didn't know how to look. So, for example, they didn't report on David Durac's, I think that's how you pronounce his name, lead editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, which asked the interesting question, then and now, of why AIDS is apparently new when viruses and homosexual behavior are as old as history, and suggested that, and I quote, "some new factor may have distorted the host-parasite relation. So-called recreational drugs are one possibility. Perhaps one or more of these recreational drugs is an immunosuppressive agent." End quote. I found it interesting that here was the lead editorial in one of the world's leading scientific journals, and it was basically totally ignored. And in some cases, even if the media had been looking, they could not have found studies such as Harry Avakos's 1982 report for the CDC of drug use among a sample of gay men. His report, as we all know, was never made publicly available. Though I would actually think that if any journalist with any sense of ability, any sense of credibility, if they had wanted to, they would have found Harry Avakos's report They simply didn't want to. The media, rather than questioning and digging, instead, and partly at government behest, adopted a somewhat paradoxical position. On the one hand, playing off homophobia and moralizing and suggesting that this was a gay plague, on the other, pursuing the line that dominated the education campaigns that we all remember, at least I remember, that we're all at risk. Posters on billboards urged people not to, quote, die of ignorance. Every household was leafleted with the message, anyone can get it, man or woman. Posters declaimed, age is not prejudice, it can kill anyone. Quote, the longer you believe AIDS only infects others, the faster it will spread. AIDS, don't die of ignorance. The popular press, as ever committed to demonstrating the integrity of the Fourth Estate, pronounced in the headlines, revenge menace from young male prostitutes. Another headline, infected men deliberately continue to take on lovers without mentioning they have AIDS. Another headline, the deadly revenge of AIDS victim who went on a sex spree. I think that was from a British newspaper. British newspapers like the phrase sex spree. It's we're kind of, you know, sex free. It's the Brits invented tabloid journalism. You do realize that, and we taught you. Prostitutes spread it like wildfire, and so on, all guaranteed to sow fear among the public. What we can in fact see in the coverage of AIDS is the highly problematic nature of news, its constructed but limited character. And if it's constructed, then someone is doing the constructing. And that construction is guided by powerful and persistent news values. As I continue to think through the manner in which the HIV/AIDS thesis have been so successfully sold, I noticed that a particularly important narrative, one that could be readily used by the news media, was that of plague. In public discourse, and in its refraction in the chatter of private lives, there was a strong sense of the idea of innocence and vulnerability, a victimology amplified by a larger collective ignorance, a profound sense of the innocent, the non-infected, once more open to malignant forces over which they had little or no control within their own lives, once again potential victims of plague. And once again, this was readily fed by popular culture. You may recall the 1995 non-fiction bestseller Richard Preston's The Hot Zone. As its cover suggests, a terrifying true story. A lot of this coverage always feels like it's been told at Halloween. The story is about the Ebola virus, a particularly nasty organism with a kill rate of about 9 in 10. Of concern to the author is that the virus, which originates in Equatorial Africa, turned up in 1989 in some monkeys in a research laboratory in Reston, Virginia. That is, within coughing distance of the White House. The narrative is structured around a military operation to prevent the virus leaving the lab and entering the civilian population. It is a riveting story, which is why it was a bestseller, playing off some primal human fears. But as I read it, the thought that kept occurring was how overwrought the writing was. No grotesque metaphor too overblown to be avoided. A writing style which oozed hyperbole about the depths of the threat from this creature that has crashed out of its jungle home. In the final, he made a lot of money off this book. This is pure jealousy on my part. I got a royalty check from Oxford University Press from my last book the other day. It was $17. We're not retiring anytime soon. That's my wife. In the final pages, the book recounts the visit Preston made to the now deserted building which had housed the monkeys in which the virus cooked. That's one of his terms, cooked. His final words are, Ebola had risen in these rooms, flashed its colors, fled and subsided into the forest. It will be back. I couldn't help but conjure up an image of the virus checking in at Kennedy International for a return flight to Zaire, down but not out, waiting for the return match. At almost exactly the moment that The Hot Zone was being published, Britain had its own brush with the bug from hell, Streptococcus abacterium, which can cause the disease known as necrotizing fascistis. Sorry? I'm sorry, I put necrotizing something. The necrotizing I haven't read. Covering the story with due understatement and subtlety, the tabloid newspaper The Daily Star had the large headline on its front page, "Killer bug ate my face." And The Sun, the best-selling newspaper in the UK, screamed, flesh bug ate my brother in 18 hours. And the Daily Mirror, not to be outdone, flesh-eating bug killed my mother in 20 minutes. That's the hyper version of necrotizing. The fact that there was nothing new in this bacterium, that while gruesome in its effect, it killed tiny numbers of people each year, particularly when compared to other bacterial infections such as TB and pneumonia, and that the chances of being infected were infinitesimal, mattered less than that it satisfied a certain kind of news value that is ignorant but loves to wallow in gore, and that readily has the ear of a public which is fascinated by the bizarre, the gruesome, the violent, the inhuman, the fearful. Here was a classic example of bad journalism causing a public panic driven by debased standards of the profession and a profound scientific illiteracy. From a journalistic standpoint, however, the bug, as with HIV, had star quality that was impossible to ignore. The director of the Public Health Laboratory in the UK was forced to declare that, quote, "there is no killer bug sweeping the country," end quote. A statement that could only be made if people thought there was a new virulent epidemic that put all at risk. The fact is that there is a political economy of fear, and the media knows it. They know that stories that frighten people are, however perversely, extremely good for circulation and ratings. The dominant cultural apparatus employ fear because fear, like blood, sells. It's something the public understand and seems to need. Fear of the other. I mean, in today's world, think Muslim and death panels of, quote, socialism, Marxism, fascism, often uttered in the same sentence, suggesting a massive intellectual confusion. And fear of the bug that is going to decimate humankind. In other words, fear, however perversely, has a crude fiscal utility. It sells. Think of the coverage of SARS, bird flu, piggy flu, all of which were represented within the narrative of plague. In somewhat different vein, think of the wall-to-wall coverage of Balloon Boy, when the media utterly fixated for hours on this strange object which just might have a small boy on board who just might plummet to his death live. Fantastic television. Fantastic television. It would have... I was in the UK when that story was happening, but even they were covering it. It would, however, be wrong to see the problem with the coverage of stories such as these and of HIV as only a function of flaws within the profession. What is buried inside the coverage of AIDS are two key elements of our own consciousness. The idea of plague I've already spoken of, but there is also the idea of cure. The fear of forces beyond our control alongside the rational optimism which sees in the triumph of science our ability to cure even the most brutal of illnesses. Indeed, so profound is our belief in the cures of science, the secular theology of the 20th and 21st century, with its priesthood of scientists, that we construct any problem, grievance, pain, fear, in conceptual terms that not only allow us to seek the cure, but demand that we do so. And nesting at the heart of this web of moods and desires was that increasingly powerful part of the global economy, and certainly the cultures of AIDS societies, the medical-industrial complex, a term coined not by any left radical, but by the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. The complex has within its gift, as it constantly reminds us, the power to offer hope. But before there can be hope, there must be hopelessness. And the consequence of the coverage by the media of the AIDS crisis was precisely to create that feeling. Mediated language is always inscribed with history, with basic, often hidden assumptions that lurk unquestioned but constrain our ways of seeing just as surely as a potter's hand shapes clay. One of the central functions of journalism is to provide a passage to the surface for manifestations of those assumptions. But since journalism in relation to science is a dependent culture, it inevitably provides a conduit for the claims of the medical-industrial complex. Those claims constitute a mythos about medical science, central to which is the idea of the cure. The problem of AIDS was conceptualized within that mythos, constructed out of lay and professional understandings of the germ theory of disease. The beauty, and I use that word carefully, the beauty of the HIV hypothesis from a journalistic standpoint was that it comported brilliantly with what we all know, that bugs are beasts and the scientist is the one who can slay them. That is a good story. What I'm suggesting is that there is a very significantly developed tendency of the modern mind to think in terms of the specificity of illness and to reconstitute the essence of a problem to match that expectation. The real problematic nature of the dominant AIDS thesis was not, could not be addressed, not because of scientific reasons, but because of culture, psychology, and historically informed, commonsensical understandings of the nature of illness. In fact, what links the vast bulk of both scientific and social scientific discourse about AIDS is that the basic thesis, the germ theory of AIDS, is assumed to be totally unproblematic. It is so because our ways of seeing illness and health and medical science make it difficult for it to be any other way, journalists included. So in proposing a counter-thesis, you are not just setting your face against scientific and industrial establishments, you are setting it against deeply ingrained beliefs in the public mind. You are, in fact, setting it against the very history of the culture. There are other obvious and important reasons why the germ theory of AIDS came to be lodged with such force within scientific and lay discourse. The first and most obvious is that huge amounts of money are tied up within a political economy of AIDS, and the obvious point that corporate and institutional interests, not to mention thousands of careers, are utterly dependent on the continued commitment to the HIV hypothesis and will do everything in their power to sustain it. Seems equally obvious that another reason why the germ theory of AIDS has proven to be so resilient and ideologically beyond challenge is that science always works by constructing paradigms that it then jealously guards, as many in this room know only too well, by declaring the dissenting voice to be the heretical voice in need of punishment and banishment. Not that there's anything new here. During his trial, Galileo wrote to the Grand Duchess Christina in a way which is curiously resonant today. Quote, "Some years ago, I discovered in the heavens many things that had not been seen before in our own age. The novelty of these things, as well as some consequences which follow from them in contradiction to the physical notions commonly held amongst academic philosophers, stirred up against me no small number of professors, as if I had placed these things in the sky with my own hands in order to upset nature and overturn the sciences. Showing a greater fondness for their own opinions than for truth, they sought to deny and disprove the new things which, if they had cared to look for themselves, their own senses would have demonstrated to them." There are finally two other thoughts that need to be considered. The mediated articulation of the health risk of HIV infection came to depend not upon relative perceived risks of certain behavioral pathologies, but upon the political necessity to argue that all sexual activity is destructive so that no one particular activity might be accused of being particularly dangerous or at risk, lest such arguments sound moralizing. It was vitally important to the emergent gay leadership in the early 1980s that the epidemic not be overly associated with the gay community. I don't blame them. The fact that a virus was being blamed suited them fine, since viruses are nothing if not democratic. The journalist and gay activist Randy Schultz observed just before he died, quote, "The gay AIDS groups were successful in their propaganda effort, saying that every heterosexual was about to get AIDS, but they weren't," close quote. Here was the ideological chaff to confuse the radar of social discourse about a serious issue, and it worked. The countervailing theses which touched on lifestyle were off the agenda. The real tragedy of the deep commitment to the HIV orthodoxy in establishment circles may ultimately lie not just or primarily in the corruption of academic freedom and the protocols of proper scientific inquiry. Rather, it may lie in the distortions in funding treatments for all kinds of illnesses that do not fall under the umbrella of HIV/AIDS. Diarrhea kills an estimated 1.5 million children under 5 every year worldwide, at least half in Africa. It's treatable with zinc tablets that cost little more than $2 each, and yet diarrhea received just 5% of worldwide research and treatment funding last year. Funding from Western sources, particularly from the United States, has clearly and massively been influenced by the central prominence of the HIV orthodoxy at the expense of funding efforts for other illnesses. Uganda's health budget, I believe this was for last year, for example, of $112 million is dwarfed by donor spending earmarked for AIDS of $167 million. We also know that in the United States, because of the politics of AIDS, HIV-related research gets proportionally much greater funding than such killers as heart disease and cancer. Let me finally say that the fights you have fought and should continue to fight were a harbinger of what America has become, a closing down, even a despising of the rational mind, a casting aside of the pursuit of truth and understanding, and the replacement with the almost willful pursuit of ignorance, so long as that comports with and feeds distressed emotional needs as well as political and economic interests. In other words, the repressing of open discourse about HIV/AIDS was but one example of a society in deep betrayal of the vision of its founders, that a democratic society needs rational, open, honest debate if it is to thrive. There is, in effect, as the literary critic Lionel Trilling put it, a moral obligation to be intelligent, not blinkered, biased, closed-minded. So it is vital, desperately important, to fight the forces of unreason, of self-serving special interest, of ignorance. I tried to do my bit in the past few years, and in the face of furious opposition, including efforts to have me fired, my green card removed, threatening letters, emails, phone calls, by arguing that Jean-Benet Ramsey was not killed by her parents and that the evidence, evidence, pointed to an intruder. I did so not because her death was singularly important, it was tragic, not singularly important, but because of the belief that if the media and the law can lie about the death of a child, what can you not lie about? And as Václav Havel has said, telling one lie will not protect us from another. So demanding that you be heard, that you not be silenced, that your work not be rejected because it is too controversial, that your research be judged on its merits, not by scientific ideologues, that you be allowed into the public square, is surely vitally important if we are to begin to really understand this thing called AIDS. But it is important, I believe, in a larger sense, in that it will be part of the process of getting back to the foundational idea that open, rational discourse is the very essence of what this society is supposed to be about. It was not meant to be one that is closed-minded, that punishes a dissenting idea, that denigrates someone simply because they utter thoughts that are uncomfortable or out of the mainstream. That was not the idea that when as a boy in England I fell in love with the idea of America. I remember when I was about 13 or 14, standing in a small bookstore in Oldham where I was born, pulling from the shelf Theodore White's Making of the President in 1960 and reading its famous first words. It was invisible as always. The it was the unfolding majesty of the democratic project on election night. The book was a wonderfully romantic, idealized view of the political process, but it was wonderful. The idea of an America that was fair and just and open and welcoming, an America that was honest and curious, an America that that young boy could dream about. I want my dream back. I want America to be what it was supposed to be, not what it has become. Do not give up your fight. Never let them win. Keep demanding that you be allowed in the public square. Make your work public and accessible to the layperson. Nag and jostle reporters and producers. Demand that you be heard, not only for your sake, but for all our sakes. So again, welcome and good luck.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was wonderfully thought-provoking and also funny. And I think in an area of discourse that is sometimes so dark, you have to develop a little black humor. If you don't enjoy black humor, the door is over there.